Hello, everyone, and welcome back to The Thing You Hate Talking About. Today, I'm going to continue talking about the 2020 US presidential elections. I had a different video in mind for this week, but a friend of mine asked me if I would go over this topic, and I thought, well, why not? Because especially since the election is around this time frame of recording, and hopefully it'll be up. This video will be up before election day, and then we can kind of hash out some things that are floating around. And the things that we're going to talk about, or the voting complaints that we're going to talk about, are voter fraud and voter suppression. So there's a lot of talk from both parties about one of these things. So the Republicans and Donald Trump are talking about voter fraud and how this election is going to be littered with it, and then this whole thing is going to be rigged and whatnot. And recently, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Wisconsin had to count their ballots on November 3rd, and that any ballots that came in after November 3rd, but were still good for November 3rd, would not count. And that was ruled in a 5-3 conservative majority that said that it would be improper for election integrity, whereas the the liberal minority stated that if the voting has been done right, it should be counted. So there is some stuff going on there with voter fraud and whatnot. And then voter suppression is being talked about by the Democratic Party, or at least members of the Democratic Party, and how there are in many Republican-controlled states that voter suppression laws or policies or rulings or practices or whatever it may be are being implemented to stop people from voting. And so I'm going to go over a little bit not necessarily who has more merit, but like which one has more clout, so to say, or which one actually makes sense. So I'm going to be talking about information from two different sources. One is the Brennan Center for Justice. It's a think tank about democracy named after Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, William J. Brennan Jr., who is an Associate Justice from 1956 to 1990. And then I'm going to go over some stuff from the Voting Rights Alliance. So first up, we're going to talk about voter fraud. And we're going to click on this link here. The Brennan Center for Justice has put a nice PDF together. And basically what it is it includes numerous different studies that talk about voter fraud not being very prevalent. It's very rare, and it doesn't really happen in the United States. There are very low rates of voter fraud to the point where they don't happen. Like it won't affect the election. Now, you can definitely go to this site, or you can definitely go to here, and I highly encourage you to. And you can click on every single link. They have hyperlinks here. You just click on them, and then it'll bring you right to these studies and whatnot. But the one study that I want to talk about is down here. It's actually a government investigation. So after Trump won the 2016 presidential election, he wanted to investigate voter fraud that he had been talking about during that election. And so he had Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach form a commission that would investigate election fraud or voter fraud, because as he said, he knew of 100 such cases in his state. So he brought 6 of those cases forward, only 4 being successful. Now, he testified that the commission reviewed 84 million votes cast in 22 states, which yielded 14 instances of voter fraud referred for prosecution, which amounts to a 0.0000017% fraud rate. Voter fraud doesn't happen. This commission that was brought forth by the president himself has found that voter fraud does not happen. It's very, very rare. And with mail-in ballots, it's also very rare. It still is. There are 5 states that mail ballots to all registered voters, and their rates of voter fraud are not higher than any other state with any other election. So bottom line, voter fraud is very rare. Okay. Voter suppression is another thing. So again, we're going to get information from the Brennan Center, but first we're going to look at the Voting Rights Alliance. They have a nice little thing that talks about 61 different forms of voter suppression. Now, some of these pertain to each other, and others are very mild forms, but some are very aggressive forms. I'm going to talk about this one independently in a little bit, but there are different things like moving polling places and getting rid of polling places and not allowing like Native Americans to vote because they don't have a residential address. Instead, they have a P.O. box. There are different disenfranchisement of ex-felons. There is different disability access. Here they have two. Failure to pre-register 17-year-olds. So help 17-year-olds register to vote so that when they turn 18, they're already registered to vote and they're ready to go, or the process is super simple. All sorts of stuff like that. And even as simple as long lines. People don't have all the time in the world to go vote. And if they can't go vote, if they don't have early voting and their only day is election day, some people might choose to stay home because they don't have that ability to, they can't afford to skip work or to skip childcare or whatever to go vote. But the big thing I want to talk about is voter ID laws, because there is a big thing in many states about implementing voter ID laws, and people think it's a good idea. And if you, on the surface, it sounds fairly decent, talking about, making sure that everybody's legit, everybody can vote, everybody's fine, we can see their picture, everything works. However, it's a form of suppression, in particular against racial minorities, because as we've been talking about, and as they point out in the forms of voter suppression tab and list, there are different things like here, closing DMVs in stricter voter ID law states. So to get your government issued ID that works, you have to go to a DMV or a county office or something like that. And for many people, they just go to the DMV because, you get a driver's license or you get other government issued IDs from the DMV. But if they are closing them down, in particular in poor areas, these people no longer have access to getting that readily available to them. They can't get that ID. It's not readily available. That access isn't. And disproportionately in the United States here, racial minorities live in poorer communities. So it's a lot harder if you're taking away that access to the DMV or to get that voter ID. It's hard, it's keeping people away from voting. And in some places, so here, this is again from the Brennan Center, this is specifically talking about voter ID in general. And they have all these numbers here and whatnot, especially like when it comes to Native Americans, they also lack this. In Texas, here's the thing, in Texas permits voters to use a handgun license to vote, but not a student ID from a state university, which is kind of odd considering that people who go to a state university, so it's in part funded by the state, that ID would work. It's a state institution, but in places like Texas, it doesn't work. And here it even says more than 80% of handgun licenses issued to Texans in 2018 went to white Texans, while more than half of the students in the University of Texas system are racial or ethnic minorities. So again, there's this disparity. So voter ID laws negatively affect, and Georgia is a huge state that is implementing voter suppression with these quote-unquote exact match laws. So basically what it means is if your name doesn't match your registration records perfectly on your forms of identification that you use in voter ID states, you don't count. It doesn't count anymore. You can't vote. Your voter registration doesn't matter anymore because it's not the same. You have a different name on your registration compared to the one on your photo ID. That doesn't check out. You might be doing fraud. And this affects people of color a lot. And so, bottom line, voter suppression is much more prevalent than voter fraud. And in particular, voter ID laws are the new push, but they are a big thing. And if you disagree with this statement, their information's there, suppression is all around. And again, there are just not voter ID laws. There are all sorts of things, because if you want people to vote, if you live in a democracy like we do, in a democratic republic like we do, in the United States, if you're from the United States watching this, you would want more people to have their voice heard, because having your voice heard in voting is essential to a democratic republic. If you don't allow people to have their voice heard, you no longer live in a democratic republic. You live in a different type of government, maybe even a different type of republic, but one that's not for the people. So really look at this information and understand that. So with that said, I hope everyone is staying safe and staying healthy at this point. And I hope that if you're a U.S. citizen and you are watching this and you are registered to vote, you go vote. And if you're not registered to vote, that you get registered to vote and that you vote. Otherwise, if you don't want to vote, I mean, I also understand that if you don't want to vote, because there are people who don't, and I don't blame you, I understand. That's a different topic for a different time. But again, I hope everybody's staying safe and healthy, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day after watching this video. Again, thank you, and solidarity, everyone.